Hey guys, what's going on? It's Andy Baker here of andybaker.com and owner of Kingwood Strength and Conditioning. And we're coming to you today with a squat Q&A video. And so what I wanted to go over with everybody today was basically three big questions that a lot of people have on the squat. Number one is, what is the biggest mechanical mistake that most people make on the squat that either causes injury or limits the amount of weight that you can do? And then a question on equipment. Specifically on belts. Should you wear a belt? And if you should wear a belt, when should you start training with a belt, and when should you put it on during your workout? And then number three is going to be squat assistance exercises. In other words, what are the most productive assistance movements that you can help to aid your squat? Okay, so that being said, let's get started. The biggest mistake that I see people make with the squat is basically stemmed from a lack of understanding about how bar position on the back affects the rest of the mechanics of the squat on the way down. Okay, so a lot of times when people come in to see me and they've never had coaching on the squat before, but they're kind of self-taught, they've taught themselves how to squat, I see a lot of the same thing, which is generally people mess up right off the bat with where they put the bar on their back, and then not understanding how the placement of that bar is going to affect the rest of their squat. Okay, so in essence, we basically have a low bar and a high bar squat. Okay, so most people watching this video already know that. And the mechanics are very different. They go beyond just wherever the bar feels most comfortable. But what I see a lot of guys doing, they're forgetting that the first step of that equation is to put the bar in the right spot across the back. And so what I see a lot of guys trying to do is a blending of the techniques. Okay, so they're placing the bar a lot of times in high bar and then trying to squat with low bar mechanics. Or it's the inverse. They're putting the bar in the right spot, but they're trying to squat with high bar mechanics. A lot of this comes from the fact that low bar squats for a lot of people are not comfortable on the shoulders. A lot of times they're even painful at first when the shoulders are really tight. And so guys try to do the starting strength style squat and they try to get under the bar and it doesn't feel comfortable. So they go, oh, well, I can't carry the bar low bar. I'll just put it up a little bit higher. And then they don't try to change anything else. And then they still try to do the starting strength style low bar squat with the bar and high bar, and that just doesn't work. Whether you choose to squat high bar or low bar is not really as important as understanding the differences between the two, and that where you place the bar on the back influences its position relative to your midfoot, okay? So no matter how you squat, or deadlift, or press, for that matter, anything that you're doing standing on 2 feet with a barbell, there's a master cue, and that master cue is to keep the barbell centered over the middle of your foot, okay? And that spot is going to be approximately where the knot is on your shoelaces, okay? Anything that you do mechanically that places the barbell forward of the midfoot or behind the midfoot is going to throw the entire system out of balance. It's going to give you poor leverage in your technique, which can lead to either missed lifts or just wasted energy working against bad technique, or it can even result in injury. When a lifter places the bar in a high bar position, and then he tries to sit back into the squat and lean forward like you would do in low bar, it's going to cause the barbell to get well forward of midfoot, okay? And this is what we see a lot when a lifter complains of having, low back pain, or he'll complain that he feels like he's going to fall over when he squats. It's because of that bar sitting up on top of the traps. When he goes to sit back into the squat and necessarily has to lean forward to counteract the posterior motion of the hips, it throws the barbell forward of midfoot, okay? So the reason we squat with a more upright torso when we high bar is because a more upright torso is what keeps the barbell centered over the middle of the foot. Okay, so when we have one of these scenarios where the lifter is carrying the bar low in low bar position across the rear delts below the traps, but they're trying to squat more with high bar mechanics. In other words, they're carrying the bar in low bar position, but they're trying to squat with a very vertical torso. There's two problems that will often arise from that, okay? One is that the lifter cannot achieve depth, okay? So if he may interpret this as maybe a lack of flexibility, or not having good mobility, or being off balance, that sort of thing. But the problem is that when the lifter has the bar low and he's keeping the torso extremely vertical, he can only go down so far before that barbell becomes so far behind the midfoot that he can no longer keep the bar in balance, okay? And so if he were to continue to squat down further than that, he probably would fall backwards. So that's the sensation that the lifter will often report is, I feel like if I go down any further, I won't be able to get back up or I'll fall over backwards. And chances are that's the reality. Because again, with the bar low and the torso very vertical, the bar is already seated behind the midfoot. So the further down he goes, the further that barbell gets behind the midfoot, the more off balance he's going to get. And below a certain threshold, there is a good chance that the lifter might fall over backwards. The other side of that is that perhaps the lifter is leaning forward a little bit, but not far enough to keep it really over the midfoot. The lifter will get down all the way to parallel, so he will be able to achieve depth, but what will happen is when he begins the ascent, and especially if he's using a lot of hip drive, he'll squat down, he'll try to drive up with the hips, and what we'll see is a very sharp change in back angle at the bottom of the squat. And that's not good. We don't want to have the barbell moving in any horizontal direction during the squat. During the course of the squat, we only want the barbell moving vertically. Straight up and straight down is ideal. And so when there's a sharp change in back angle at the bottom, it can throw, especially if the squat is heavy, it can throw the whole lifter off balance, and it has the potential for injury or at least a very inefficient squat. As he comes up, in order for that barbell to go up, it has to find the midfoot. So I always tell my lifters, the barbell wants to be centered over the midfoot, okay? So as you begin that ascent, in order to go up, the barbell is going to find that middle of the foot position. And so if it's starting behind the midfoot, it's going to shift forward, okay? And at the bottom of a squat is not a good place for that barbell to shift forward. The angle of your torso, okay, the back angle, if you will, on a squat is somewhat, it's going to be dependent, yes, on the bar position, but also on your own anthropometry. In other words, the way that you're built. So some builds are going to necessitate a little bit more vertical torso. Some will be a little bit more horizontal. So it just depends on how you're built. But the main thing is get the barbell over the midfoot. If you find that you feel like you're constantly off balance to the back or constantly off balance to the front, check your bar position and make sure that your mechanics are squaring up with your bar position. And then if you are carrying the bar high bar, if you have to do that, that you're squatting correctly with high bar technique and vice versa for low bar. Okay, so next we are going to move on to the subject of belts and other supportive equipment. The primary question here being is, should I invest in a belt? Should I buy a belt? And then more specifically from that is, at what point do I need to start wearing my belt? So if I'm a novice and I'm new to strength training, do I need to buy a belt right off the bat and start using it as a novice? Or is there some certain threshold of weight or strength that I should meet first and then start using the belt? And then even more specifically than that is, during a workout itself, when should I put the belt on? Should I put it on right off the bat while I'm warming up, with the empty barbell, or should I wait until I get to my heavy work sets and put the belt on at that point, or someplace in between? So I'm going to do my best to give you my opinion on the matter. I'm going to start with kind of what is the major objection that people have to using a belt. The major objection that most people have to using a belt is that doing so doesn't allow you to use your core, okay? You're not using your abs, your obliques, your low back, because you're artificially supporting it with the belt. And to a degree, that is true. You will squat more with a belt than you will without the belt, which means there is, I guess if you want to call it an artificial aid, there is a component of that. And so a lot of people view it as a slippery slope. In other words, if I start wearing a belt, well, then the next thing I'm going to be in knee wraps, and then the next thing from there I'm going to be wearing a squat suit, and it's kind of a slippery slope of equipment. And so I'd rather just not use any equipment at all, and I'm just going to squat, in a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. So, at the end of the day, it's up to you what you want to do. I think a belt is a good idea because my justification for using it is, as my belted squats get higher, so does my beltless squats, okay? You can go on YouTube and, look at a guy that's doing beltless squats with 500 pounds. Well, he didn't develop the ability to do his beltless squats by squatting beltless. He developed that 500-pound beltless squat by squatting with a belt with 600 pounds. So your beltless squat will rise as a percentage of what you can ultimately do without one. That's not necessarily true when you talk about using knee wraps and squat suits and that sort of thing. So there is a degree to which these different supportive equipment give us, okay? So yes, a belt does aid us a little bit, whereas knee wraps and a squat suit aid us a lot, to the point where we're not actually getting much stronger when we're using those type of equipment in our training. But a belt is an important tool to use in your training. It reinforces your posture. It keeps your technique solid when you're under heavy load, and it still is allowing you to operate the barbell with the primary movers, which are the hips and the knees. Okay, so it helps to support you in a role of stabilization. Okay, so it helps support your back angle and keep your spine in a good neutral position, create some pressure internally, which just keeps you tighter under the bar. Yes, it's going to help you lift a little bit more weight, but it also helps keep you safer. What it doesn't do, that knee wraps and a suit do is help reinforce the actual lever systems that are moving the weight. So when you squat, your low back and your abs aren't actively moving the weight. Okay, they are acting more as a transmitter of force rather than a generator of force. So they're helping to stabilize your spine as a transmitter of force into the bar, whereas it's your hips and your knees and the muscles that operate your hips and your knees that are acting to push the weight up. So they're generating the force. Knee wraps and squat suits directly aid the hips and the knees in the generating of force. So you're getting force generated through the hips and the knees that you wouldn't get without those pieces of equipment. Okay, and so that's where I kind of draw the line there for me with training. Is a belt helps me to maintain more tightness and be safer under the bar, while it's not actually aiding the muscles that help to push the weight up. Okay, if that makes sense. So again, it's up to you. My philosophy is that as my belted squat goes up, I stay safe, and my beltless squat, if that's something that I'm concerned about, which I'm not really, but if it was, I'm going to get my beltless squat stronger by getting stronger first in a belted squat. Okay. Now, when do you need to buy a belt? Okay. At what point do you need to start operating with a belt? Do you need one from day one as a novice? No, you don't. You can operate probably for a couple of months without one. While you're doing, light weights, while you're at 95 pounds, 135 pounds, there's no problem if you're doing those without a belt. If you're like me and you work with the general public a lot and you're having a hard time maybe getting your clients invested in the right type of personal equipment, I would always emphasize shoes before I would emphasize a belt. So I want to try to get my clients in the right type of footwear first, a good pair of weightlifting shoes, squat shoes first, and then I'll worry about a belt later. Certainly by kind of towards the end of their novice phase, the beginning of their intermediate phase, I want to try to have them in a belt, because at that point they're going to be really starting to strain against heavier loads, and I want to make sure the mechanics are held up tight. So I try to get them into a belt within a couple of months of training if they're going to be lifting seriously. As far as is there a certain threshold of weight that you need to be doing before you? No, because everybody's so much different on where they begin. I mean, I train people from 15-year-old kids to 75-year-old adults and everybody in between. So I don't have a certain number that everybody has to hit, because numbers are all over the place in terms of what's heavy. And so for me, it's more of time under the bar. A few months in, they're going to start to struggle against loads that are where the barbell, the speed is starting to slow down on their work sets. And at that point, we'll go ahead and start talking about perhaps purchasing a belt. So as far as when in the workout should you start wearing your belt, you need to put one on immediately from the first warm-up set with the empty bar all the way through the work sets, or halfway in between, or where do you put it on at? A little bit different for everybody. When I first get somebody into a belt with their first couple of workouts with a belt, I'll generally have them put the belt on fairly early into the workout. So maybe not the sets with the empty bar, but maybe the very first set that we add load to. Mainly because I'm trying to, break the belt in. This isn't as much of a problem now because the new belts that they make come already pretty broken in, but the older stiff belts, that we used to get, 10 years ago, they came in pretty stiff. So you had to spend some time kind of breaking your belt in so that it wasn't so stiff while you were training with it. But it doesn't alter, the belt doesn't alter the mechanics of the squat, but it does alter the feel of the squat to the lifter. And so I like to get them comfortable in the belt as quickly as possible. I don't want to throw a new variable in at them on their heavy work set. Okay, so if the lifter's squatting 315 for the first time, I don't want to throw a belt at them and say, here, wear this for your work set. for this brand new PR set, because that's a variable that they're not used to. So I'm going to start introducing it early in the warm-ups, and so that they can get a feel for it, all the way up through their work sets. And then I'm probably going to do that for several workouts. And then after that, if they want to phase out of it and not wear it for the first few warm-up sets, that's fine. So if you're going to work up to 365, maybe you don't wear it for the bar, 135, 225, 275, and then you put it on for 315. And that would be the one that I always emphasize. The only warm-up set that I always emphasize that lifters wear a belt for is make sure you're wearing your belt at least for your last warm-up set before your heavy work set. And that's just my own personal philosophy on warming up, is that the very last warm-up set, you should seek to do everything that you can to make it as close to exact as what your work sets are going to be. So down to from the technique all the way down to the supportive equipment. You're trying to fine-tune that form and kind of dial it in. You want to do it with whatever supportive equipment you're going to be wearing for your work sets. Wear it on that last warm-up set, and then it's really up to you on whether or not you want to wear it on the warm-up sets that lead up to that. I typically won't wear a belt for the first 3 to 4 warm-up sets. I may do as many as 5 or 6. So the first 3 or 4, with the bar, 135, 225, I typically don't wear a belt. And then maybe by the time I get to, 315, 365, I go ahead and throw on a belt. But it's really up to you, however you want to do it. All right, guys, so third and final part of the squat Q&A is going to be about squat assistance movements and what movements work best that help the squat. Where should I put them? How do I fit them in my training schedule, that sort of thing, or should I even do them at all? So let me start with the last question, which is, should you even do them at all? If you're a novice, if you're an early intermediate, the answer is probably not. Squats respond really well to frequency and volume, and they respond really well to just kind of repeating the same movement over and over again with just fluctuations in volume and intensity. So as a novice, you don't really need any fluctuations. You don't need to introduce any other squat variations into your programming, and you really shouldn't, because as a novice, you don't know how to squat yet, and you're not going to be a good squatter for probably several months into your program. And so you need to just focus on the basic squat, and introducing different variations of the squat, like front squats or squatting with specialty bars or box squats or things like that. All they're going to wind up doing for most novices is just screwing up their movement pattern. So learn to squat first with just the basic movement, like in the starting strength linear progression is a great novice program. Obviously, we're going to start with basically a single exercise, just the squat, and a set volume, 3 sets, 5 reps. And the only variable that we're going to have in there is intensity. So we're just going to add a little bit of weight to the bar. As a intermediate trainee, basically we're going to still just stay with the squat for the most part, and we're going to start making fluctuations to volume and intensity. Okay, so you're going to have maybe a higher volume day with lower intensity, and then a higher intensity day with less volume, and that sort of thing. And there's almost an endless amount of kind of permutations of sets, reps, volumes, and intensities that we can use to kind of keep progress going on the squat. But after a certain point in time, you're going to kind of run out of just sets, reps, volume, intensity, that sort of thing as a training variable. And so a very good way to kind of spur new progress is with the addition of variants of the squat as assistance movements. If you're having any kind of issues with your squat technique or form, which by the time you get to this point in your training is kind of a late stage intermediate, all your technique flaws should be cleaned up by now. And if you've made it this far, chances are you're a decently athletic person who has mastered the squat at this point. So you can start introducing variations of the squat without throwing off your basic form that much. That being said, we're pretty much going to always keep, at least with, I'd say at least every other week, but really every week is probably better, to at least be squatting with our regular squat form at least once a week. At the very least, I'd say, every other week for most people. And then within that context, you can start introducing some variations of the squat, okay? And that can be, there's all different things that you can do, okay? You can introduce some high bar squats, you can introduce front squats, you can introduce pause squats, paused box squats, rack squats, front squats, I think I already said that. So there's, specialty bar squats, so squatting with a cambered bar or safety squat bar, things of that nature. So there's most of your squat assistance movements that are going to be helpful are basically barbell based squat variations. So Machine-based things, leg presses, hack squats, leg extensions, single leg work, lunges, those sorts of things. We're mainly only going to operate with those things if we're on a hypertrophy-based bodybuilding style program. I haven't found that any of those really directly influence your squat training all that much. They can help with hypertrophy and just adding non-squatting volume to your leg routine to where you can build up a lot of sets and reps and a lot of volume to help build some muscle mass. But in terms of carryover to actual squatting strength, your squatting variations are going to be where you make your money. You really want to emphasize the squat. Let's say you're kind of operating on a 4-day upper-lower type split. Then you're going to have one day where you're emphasizing just the basic back squat and another day where you're emphasizing the deadlift. And make sure that on your deadlift day, you're also doing some form of squatting, okay? And so you might actually have 3 different squatting variations that you do during the week. So on your squat day, you might start with just your basic low bar back squat, and then upon the completion of that, you might do a variation. And usually we do something that's pretty easy to transition to. So if you do, say, 3 sets of 5 reps of a low bar back squat, we might strip some weight off the bar and do 3 sets of 8 reps or 3 sets of 10 reps of a high bar back squat or even a front squat. So a very easy to transition to variation of the squat, okay? So we'd have your regular squats and then transition right into a variation of it. And then on your other lower body day of the week, we would maybe start with deadlifts and then do another squatting variation. So that could be a paused box squat, a rack squat, a front squat, something different than you did on the first squatting day of the week is usually how I like to do it. And what this does is it just gives you 2 variations of the squat that you can build upon. And I really prefer this to just doing light squats. For an early intermediate, I do like a lot of just kind of light squatting days. In other words, just take the basic variation of the squat and do a lighter version of it. So pull 10-20% off the bar, maybe reduce the volume a little bit, and just kind of an active recovery light day squat. It helps to dial in the form a little bit and kind of grease the groove. But really, as you get into late stage intermediate, you really shouldn't need to grease the groove anymore by just squatting light, okay? A much more effective course of action to take a variation of the squat that you can actively build on, okay? So let's say we're gonna squat for our regular low bar back squat. Let's say that's our competitive variation of the squat. And then we're gonna follow that each week with, say, 3 sets of 8 of a high bar squat. Okay, so if we're not very good at high bar squatting when we first start, let's maybe say we can do 3 sets of 8 with 225. Well, what's going to happen is if over the course of several weeks or several months, you build up from 3 sets of 8 at 225 to 3 sets of 8 at 315. Okay, is that going to make your low bar back squat stronger? Probably it will if you continue to train it. And then let's say on this other day of the week, we decide we're going to do after we deadlift, we're going to do a paused box squat. Okay, a below parallel paused box squat. And maybe we're not very good at those either when we start. We can do 3 sets of 5 at 275, but over the course of a few weeks, a few months, we build that up from 275 to 365. Okay, if we do that on the box squat and we do that on the high bar squat, are those 2 things going to influence what we can do on the low bar squat? The answer is yes, it should if you program them correctly. So if your sets, reps, and that sort of thing, your recovery is in order, then making significant progress like that on those very close squat variations can and should help you progress on your regular back squat. So in terms of what exercises should you choose for your supplemental squat work, my best advice is to start with something simple and basic as a variation. So if all you've ever done up to this point is just the basic low bar back squat, don't transition from that right into pause safety squat bar box squats with mini bands. Okay, that's going to be a little bit too much variation for kind of a mid-stage intermediate lifter. So start with something basic, just transition to, say, a high bar back squat and a front squat. Make those your 2 variations that you start to work with. So I'd say just pick 1 or 2 and work on building those up. And then over time, you can introduce more and more variations in there. I would probably stick with just basic barbell movements at first, as opposed to moving into specialty bar movements. Then once you get used to, say, doing just basic, maybe a basic pause squat or a basic high bar squat or a basic front squat, pick those 2 or 3 and then start introducing other elements into there, like paused box squats or paused pin squats in the rack. And then start looking at maybe adding in specialty bars, or then introducing even things like bands and chains, but just introduce kind of one degree of variation at a time, and don't get too radical too soon. The reality is that, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter that much which variations that you pick. I like to pick things that the lifter's not that good at, because that's going to give him more room to kind of progress and make his squat stronger. So if you're really, really not good on your front squats, but then you get really, really good on your front squats, and you develop quite a bit of strength on front squatting, chances are that acquisition of strength on the front squat is going to carry over to your back squat, okay? And so I don't necessarily pick movements that are easy for me to do, that I can do, like for me, the paused box squat. I can do almost as much weight on a paused box squat as I can on a regular squat. So for me, it doesn't have that much carryover because I'm naturally pretty good at a paused box squat. I still like to do them, but I don't think that they actually help to build my regular squat nearly as much as, say, high bar squats and front squats do, which I'm not really that good at. So that probably leads me to think that I'm much stronger squatting with my posterior chain. So like a paused box squat, I'm very strong and explosive with, but I'm not really good at front squats, and I'm not really good at high bar back squats. So when I really push those two exercises and I get stronger on those, I notice an immediate difference on my regular squats.